I'm going to say, this is a friend of mine. That means you're a connected guy. Now, if I said instead, this is a friend of ours, that would mean you're a made guy. I capisci?
Yeah, friend of mine, friend of ours. What do I call you, friend of ours?
Keep your fucking mouth shut about me. I'll say, get down.
What's up, and welcome to the Crime and Mafia podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Nadeau. This is episode 3. We're talking about Vincent the ChIn Gigante, and I hope you're all having a great day wherever you are. Hope you're getting through this quarantine, and hope you are staying safe. Obviously, we have rules that we have to follow, and it sucks, but like we've all said, it'll be over eventually, and we can get back to our normal lives. I will put this out there. If you need to chat, you want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Jeff Nadeau. Really been happy with the response to the show. Obviously, it's brand new. It's totally different than what I normally do. I sports bet and I talk about games and all sorts of stuff like that. But, you know, this has always been, as I said, a passion of mine to talk about crime and the mob. And people have enjoyed the show. We did the Black Mafia in the first episode. And last week we did the Mafia Cops. It was a fun episode as well. But this week I'm really excited. This is one that's near and dear to me. When people ask me on Periscope, big man, Jeff, who's your favorite mob guy ever? And without a doubt, I always say Vincent Gigante. To me, his cunning and smart ability to avoid law enforcement and his cat and mouse game was just fascinating. I think outside of Carlo Gambino, I think he's arguably the greatest mobster ever. The ability of him, as far as being shrewd to avoid it, to come up with these sinister and wild plots and things, and his ability to just make money and to do it without being noticed is really fascinating. And I'm interested and excited to delving into it today. So yeah, sit back, relax. If you ever have any questions on the mob or you want to talk about a certain subject, you want me to hit a certain subject, make sure you reach out. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment at the bottom, and we'll get to all those. So let's get into it. Vincent Gigante on the Crime and Mafia podcast. By the way, shout out to Donnie Brasco for the opening there. A great scene between those two guys, Pacino and Depp. One of the most underrated mob movies ever. Loved it. Let's get into it. Vincent Gigante. Vincent Gigante was born March 29th, 1928, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He had 4 brothers. So there are 5 brothers in the family, which you don't see often. That's pretty crazy. He was the son of Yolanda and Salvatore Gigante. They're both from Naples, so he's a Napolitan. And during his childhood, his mother and father, his dad actually had a decent job. He was a jewel engraver, and his mother was actually a seamstress. So they did okay, but obviously 5 kids is always tough. As a young child, Vincent, who was, in that time, neighborhood, little groups were developing. He went to public school. It was said that when he was a kid, he would actually extort his own classmates, surprisingly enough. He would give them loans, like small amounts of money. And it was said that early on he had caught on to the mob life pretty quickly. And in that neighborhood, I mean, you had a lot of people to look up to. You had, Luca Luciano and, people like that, Vito Genovese, who we'll get into. But it's interesting. The 5 brothers in the family, 4 of them, 3 of them actually followed Vincent into the life of the mob. Mario, Pasquale, and Ralph all followed him into the mob lifestyle. He had one brother, though, Louis, that actually ended up becoming a priest, a Catholic priest. He had a parish in the South Bronx. He ended up becoming a city councilman many years later. And it's interesting because Louis would become a wide and interesting part of his life later on, which we'll get into. But as a younger kid, he obviously went to public school. He went to public school 3 in the West Village. And up until 9th grade, he attended high school. But at that point, 16, 17 years old, he decides that, and at that time, if you look back into that era, most young Italian men would go get jobs. They obviously had to support families. They had to grow up and move on. And high school at that point really didn't provide much. I mean, most of these kids weren't going to go to college, and they could learn what they needed to on the street, or they already learned. So high school had become kind of redundant. Vincent leaves high school and actually gets into the tailor trade. He begins to learn how to become a tailor. During that time, he becomes a guy that starts to box. He starts getting into pro boxing. He does some amateur fights and things like that. And he actually worked with a guy named Tommy Aboli. Thomas Aboli at that time was a mobster. He was the acting boss of the Genovese crime family. He becomes Gigante's mentor and manager. He basically sees a lot in Vincent and takes him kind of under his wing. He actually was a pretty decent boxer, Vincent. He had 25 fights. He had 21 wins and just 4 losses. 13 of his wins came by knockout. He fought in Madison Square Garden. He actually was a pretty decent fighter. And a lot of people feel that and thought that his nickname came from, him being a fighter, ChIn. He had a good chin. But his name, the ChIn, actually came from his mother. When he was a small child, his mother would call him, because in the neighborhood they had so many different Vincents, that if he would say, "Vinny, come home," no one would know who the hell they were talking about. So in Italian, obviously the Italian form of Vincent is Vincenzo. She would call him Cenzino, and ChIn was derived from that. And they would call him Vinny ChIn. So that's where he got the nickname. But as he became a boxer, he started to do some decent things. He went pro in the light heavyweight division. And, during all this time, even when he was a tailor, his mob stuff or his boxing stuff, he was still doing stuff for mobsters. He was doing low-level work for Vito Genovese, Tommy Aboli, little things like, stealing cars, receiving stolen goods, bookmaking, things like that. And he actually, at one point, is arrested in a college basketball betting card ring. He was basically going to local universities in New York and handing out betting cards. And he was actually arrested for that. He ended up doing 2 months in jail for it. But for most of the his young adult life, he didn't get arrested much. He didn't do any time really outside of that small sentence. And he was quickly showing mob guys that he was a guy that could earn and he could do things. He earned the credentials of kind of being in the mob as a soldier and an enforcer in the 50s. It's important to realize that in the 50s, in the late 50s, 1957, that kind of time, Vito Genovese was jockeying for power. He was looking to assume control of the family. He did not like Frank Costello, the boss of the family, and he basically needed a way to move in and take what he thought was his. So he kind of establishes a connection with Carlo Gambino. And at the time, the Gambino crime family was not the Gambino crime family. It was called the Anastasia crime family. And Albert Anastasia was in control of that group. Carlo Gambino was a young and up-and-comer as well. He wanted control of his family as well. So they kind of worked in tandem. Carlo Gambino plotted the hit on Albert Anastasia, and he then carried it out that same year. And during that time, Vito Genovese, who wanted to be boss, he decides, I'm going to make my move on Frank Costello. So at this point, he had a connection with Vincent Gigante. Vincent Gigante was kind of a protege of Genovese. He worked as a driver and an enforcer. And in 1957, Genovese basically orders ChIn to murder Frank Costello. So in May of 1957, Costello is coming home to his home in New York. He lived in an apartment building, Central Park West. And Gigante emerges in the doorway. And as he pulls the gun, he basically says to Frank Costello, "Frank, this is for you." And Frank was able to kind of shield himself, and he ends up getting grazed by the bullet. It grazes his side of his head, and he falls down and basically pretends to be dead. ChIn assumes that he's dead and leaves. So he ends up attempting to kill Costello, but it didn't work. He ended up surviving. The problem was, a doorman emerges and sees this. So he gets a look at ChIn Gigante. ChIn then basically realizes that he's going to have an attempted murder charge. He ends up going on the lam. He goes up to, I believe, the Poconos, and he goes on a strict diet. He loses like 40 pounds. He changes his physical appearance a little bit because he knew, this is how smart ChIn Gigante was. He knew that the doorman saw kind of a plumper. He had, plumper version of himself. He had stopped boxing by this time. He had started to gain a little weight. And he knew that he, if altered his appearance, maybe it would allow the doorman to kind of have a distorted version of what he looked like and throw him off. Obviously, years later, he in 1958, ChIn was apprehended, and he went to trial. Obviously, living by the code, Frank Costello would never identify who shot him, so that was a dead end for the prosecution. They knew that Frank Costello would not, even though he knew that they wanted him dead, he would not give up ChIn Gigante. And at this point, the doorman, his evidence was called into question because ChIn didn't look anything like the person that he said he saw. So ChIn was able to beat the rap on a attempted murder. And it was said, and this was never proven, but it was said that in the courtroom, after this all happened, ChIn was overheard saying to Costello, Costello told him, look, you got away with this one, but, and I did you a solid. So, Costello, for the guy that he was, he still lived by the code. And at that point, Costello kind of saw the writing on the wall. He decided to move on and relinquish power. And Vito Genovese was the new boss of the Genovese crime family, which was good for ChIn because ChIn had obviously failed at killing Costello, but it moved him up. And he was able to kind of grow in the Genovese crime family, which is, as a young mobster, your goal is to show the upper echelon that you can commit crime, you can earn, you can do things, and ChIn did that. By 1959, ChIn was dealing drugs. He was selling heroin. And in that year, he was actually arrested along with Vito Genovese for heroin trafficking. ChIn ends up kind of lucking out again. He only gets 7 years in prison. And a lot of the sentence and the ability to be paroled had to do with his connections to the community. According to many, he got a lot of community leaders to step up and send in all these well wishes about ChIn, and he ended up getting paroled after 5 years. So ChIn did, obviously ChIn again kind of lucks out on stuff. And that was really the kind of definition of his life. He was able to find ways to get out of things and not do a ton of prison time. So, by this point, ChIn was 31 years old. And as a mob guy, he had really only done about 5 years in prison. So he ended up doing pretty decent jobs. And, I feel like as a young mobster, going to prison is important because it shows the family that you can, you're committed to what you're doing and you're at the end going to get repaid for it. After ChIn was paroled, about 5 years into his sentence, he was promoted to captain. And, that's for any mobster, that's the early goal. I mean, once you can become a captain, and at 31 becoming captain, that was huge for ChIn because once you become a captain, you have your own crew. So you have people below you that will do what you say, and they will earn for you. And ChIn had a great setup because he had the Greenwich Village crew. They were a group that he ran with as a child or as a younger adult. People like his, 3 brothers were involved. He had close associates: Dominic Cirillo, Louis Manna, Frank Condo, Venaro Mangano, Dominic Alonghi. He had guys that were part of his early life, and they were able to kind of create this crew. And it was perfect because Manhattan was a treasure trove of money. And we'll get into that in just a second. ChIn's crew was based out of the Triangle Social Club on 208 Sullivan Street. For anyone that doesn't know New York, and I just kind of want to set the stage of what and where this is, 208 Sullivan Street is in Greenwich Village. It's just east of Houston Street, basically. So it's directly south of Washington Square Park and NYU. So between Bleecker and 3rd was this block. And that's where 208 Sullivan Street was. That's also where ChIn's mother lived. ChIn's mother lived at 215 Sullivan Street. So everything was in one area, and they can move and do things. And that was really the spot that they did everything. They also had some other social clubs in the area, McDougal Street, Thompson Street, and a lot of ChIn's business dealings actually went on at his mother's home. He would do some of his loan sharking and bookmaking jobs, and even his labor racketeering. A lot of it will come out of his mother's apartment because it was a great way to shield what was actually going on. I mentioned obviously that New York, and particularly Manhattan, was a treasure trove of gold, basically. And ChIn was particularly good at labor racketeering, construction industry, the garment district, haulage industries, garbage, things like that. And a lot of the crime that they controlled had a lot to do with that. So, into the 70s, I mean, they were controlling everything. I mean, labor unions, they were doing all the gambling, hijackings, extortion, loan sharking, drug dealing, everything that you would know that was going on in Manhattan, they had a piece of. And the influence really was perfect because not only did they have, the upper, East Side, Greenwich Village, their extension went into Manhattan, up into, kind of the neighborhoods that face the Hudson River. So the Bronx, Yonkers, Westchester, that was all controlled by the Genovese crime family. And, look, I'm not going to talk down on Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island, but they weren't the treasure troves that New York and Manhattan was. So, ChIn really had prime real estate, frankly, and they were able to figure it out. By this point, some of his closest associates were his family, his brother Ralph, his brother Mario, his brothers were integral parts of the crime crew. His sons at this point were involved. And I want to kind of just touch quickly on his family at this point. Vinny Gigante had a kind of an interesting home life. In 1969, ChIn had obviously become kind of a mover and shaker. He was making money, and he had a family. He was married to his wife, Olympia. They had a couple children. ChIn decides, like most mobsters, I'm going to move out of the city. I'm not going to shit where he obviously. He moved his family to a town called Old Tappan. It's in Bergen County. It's kind of a scenic area. You got a lawn. You got woods behind you. It's basically just across the river from like Dobbs Ferry, which is up towards like Mount Vernon, above Yonkers. So he really had just a quick trip down the Palisades Parkway to get into the city. So he moves his family out to Old Tappan. And this is where ChIn really kind of, I think, delved into this way of eluding law enforcement. So he moves out to Old Tappan and decides that he was going to try to muscle his way into politics in that area. So he knew that the small police force, maybe they were a little soft and he could kind of knock around them a little bit. And he could maybe bribe them, get them on his side because, hey, he was ChIn Gigante. No one was going to just, not listen to what he says. At that point, it backfires and the state of New Jersey files a conspiracy to bribe the entire police force charge on him. So he basically wanted them to give him, jobs that the FBI was involved with. And he thought he'd had a ready-made connection there. He didn't. Here's where it gets interesting. ChIn had always found that, and I think he knew that if he pretended to be mentally unstable or deranged in some way, that would be a way that he could be mentally unfit to stand trial. So what he would do is he would go see local psychiatrists. He would even check himself into mental hospitals. It was a ploy by him to basically pretend that he was mentally unstable, and there was no way he could do any of this. You could just blame it on him being nuts. And this accusation of bribing law enforcement was actually dropped. His lawyers presented reports from local psychiatrists that he indeed was possibly schizophrenic, and that the whole bribing police was really just a deranged, pathetic, nutty way of him, talking stupid. And it was said that Vincent Gigante would talk like openly about like God told him to do things and that he was like hearing voices and hallucinating and stuff. So it ended up allowing him to beat the rap on this as well. So there's becoming a kind of a clear and concise process here. Vincent Gigante commits crimes. He's largely unreported. And when he does get arrested for low level things or even, bribing people, he just kind of blames being unfit. And that's something that he would do his entire life. There was said that during the 70s, he checked himself into mental hospitals 30 different times. And that was a ploy for him every couple of months to basically, look, I'm mentally unfit. And he was able to kind of move in secret because at this point in the 70s and in the 60s, there was very little cops knew about the mob. They didn't really, they didn't really do much to stop them. There was no high level surveillance. There was no commission trial. There was no RICO Act. So for ChIn, he was able to move in silence. He's able to do what he had to do up until the 70s and 80s. In 81, Vito Genovese, actually in '69, Vito Genovese dies. He dies from from health complications, and they name a successor. Now at that point, it didn't last long. It was about 10 years. Benny the Squint Lombardo assumed control of the family. Who, in his own right, Benny the Squint was very secretive. He began his career in Harlem. He was a guy that worked kind of in the same circles as ChIn. And he decides to retire. He had some health problems of his own. And this is where ChIn assumes control of the family. ChIn becomes the boss. And ChIn, like Lombardo, decides that to be a mob guy is to be secret, is to no one ever know you exist. And that's how a mob guy should be. And that's why later in his life, ChIn Gigante hated John Gotti. It was pretty clear that, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But so ChIn becomes acting boss of the Genovese crime family. But ChIn knew that the goal of the Genoveses was to prove secret. And they developed a system where basically they would create a front boss to protect the actual boss. And it was a great system because it really, at this point, law enforcement was scattering. They had no idea who the boss was. And basically, they appoint Tony Salerno. Fat Tony Salerno was the boss of the Genovese crime family. Now, in his own right, Tony Salerno was a huge boss. He made a ton of money. He was integral in the Gigante Javits construction, all sorts of things. So he was the front boss of the Genovese crime family. And, at that point, ChIn could insulate himself, and they were making a ton of money. You look at really every stronghold of New York, everything as far as lucrative racket, ChIn and the family had their hands in. I mean, the Coliseum, the Javits Center, they ran all the drywall business, the Fulton Fish Market, private waste and garbage hauling, the gambling rackets, drug trafficking, prostitution, everything that they did in the Manhattan area, ChIn had his hands into. The Concrete Club, for instance. You have to realize in the 70s and 80s, the mob controlled concrete in New York. They charged whatever they wanted, and each family got a piece. So every yard of concrete that went into those buildings, the mob had their hands in. There was massive amounts of dollars being pumped into New York, and the mob had a direct receipt of that. So and this is actually interesting nowadays because when Donald Trump was in his goal to become president, which obviously ended up doing, there was a lot of connection of, well, Donald Trump had mob connections. Look, if you did business in Atlantic City, New York in the 70s and 80s, you had connections to the mob. You didn't have direct connections, but they had their hands in everything. It was hard to go to Atlantic City and not deal with something connected to Nicky Scarfo. Same thing in New York. The mob controlled everything. And ChIn was one of the leaders of that. They also controlled the House Wreckers Union, Local 98. They controlled Local 95. I mean, they controlled everything. Everything they did, they had their hands in. And the goal of ChIn to make Salerno the boss was huge because in 1986, by this point, Rudy Giuliani had created the commission trial. At that point, RICO was a thing. There was a way to prove that if you were the head of a crime family, you could get life in prison. And at that point in 1986, Fat Tony Salerno involved, as well as other guys like Tony Dux Corralo, Lucchese's, Paul Castellano, all these guys, they were all indicted in the commission trial at some point. Tony Salerno gets racketeering and is sentenced to 100 years. Tony Salerno ended up getting kind of a raw deal. I mean, again, the FBI does shady things to arrest people, and they're willing to look past certain things. It was pretty clear that Tony Salerno was not the real boss of the family, but the FBI basically realized that, hey, look, we're going to get somebody here. It's not like Tony Salerno is a nobody. He's a big-time guy. He's making a ton of money. And as usual, ChIn Gigante gets out of it. But it's amazing because during that trial for Tony Salerno, there was actually wiretaps that bugged Salerno and a capo, Matty Ianello, in a car talking about low-level mobsters that may become members. And, Salerno basically had no idea who these people were, and he basically muttered, like, we'll leave it up to the boss, which, if you knew anything about ChIn Gigante, he was incredibly secretive. And he had these rules where basically if you would ever mention his name in public, that was grounds for being murdered. Like, he did not put up with it. So they would always refer to the boss as the boss or him or whoever. So it was pretty clear that even Vinny Cafaro, the fish Cafaro, who's a rat and an informant, he basically even said that, look, you got it wrong. Salerno is not the boss. It's Gigante. They didn't really do much about it. Gigante finds a way to evade it. Once Salerno goes to jail, and look, Salerno is an old school guy as well. He was never going to admit that Vinny Gigante was the boss. So at that point, ChIn decides, all right, I'm just going to leave that spot open. I don't need to name a boss. We'll just leave them wondering. At that point, he appoints a guy, Dominic Cirillo, to be his messenger. And Dominic Cirillo was, in retrospect, he was the acting front boss, basically. He was never given the title, really, but Dominic Cirillo was a trusted associate of Vinny Gigante. He's been a long-time mobster. I mean, he's from the neighborhood. He's from, neighboring Harlem. And he actually had a long connection with Gigante. He was actually involved with Tommy Aboli back when Gigante was a boxer. And they all worked together. So he was a trusted guy, and he would act as basically the messenger. So when ChIn had, things to get to the rest of the family, he would go through Dominic Cirillo, and everything was, a way to evade law enforcement and not be caught up. Liborio Bellomo, he was also involved. He was kind of a street guy. He dealt with kind of the rackets and was the remote supervision of Gigante. One thing about ChIn, he would never do. He would never leave his home without people in it. He was worried about a bug. He was worried about the FBI putting bugs in his home. So he would always have someone in his house. He was never alone. It was never alone. It was never unsupervised. But he was disciplined. He was a really sharp guy. He was what you should be as a mobster. Nobody knew he was a mob guy. He moved in secret. He moved in silence. He would do business at night. And he would come up with coded language. He would come up with whispering. He would go into a social club and he would whisper to his associates so there's no way to pick it up on bugs. He would, use his hands to come up with ideas. They would never speak of anything on the phone. He did everything directly through emissaries. And that's how the mob should be. And that's why the mob was brought down. If they all lived like Vinny Gigante, the mob would still be quite powerful. I don't know how you would ever, put them on trial because, again, outside of rats, the problem is rats ruin the mob. Rats and wiretaps. And that's how the cops over the years have evolved. But again, you look at a guy like John Gotti. I mean, John Gotti was a great mob guy, but at the end of the day, John Gotti wanted to be in the spotlight. His whole thought was, how do I be a mobster if nobody knows I'm a mobster? He loved being on the news. He loved talking to, to John Miller, whoever it was from the news. He loved being on camera, and ChIn despised shit like that. He hated it. He didn't want to be on camera. He didn't want anyone to know who he was. Now, again, the thing about Gigante and being in the mob is, obviously he could control his industry from, the social club, but he also had to commit murder. He also had to order murders. And one place ChIn was pretty involved with was Philadelphia. He had a lot of connections with Philip Testa and Angelo Bruno. And he actually had to deal with several people that decided to move on those bosses. Anthony Caponegro actually moved on Angelo Bruno and killed Angelo Bruno. Uh, ChIn Gigante ordered the hit on Caponegro. He also moved on Frank Sindone and other folks like Frank Narducci, who ordered the hit on Philip Testa. Now, all those murders, Bruno and Testa, they were unsanctioned hits. They didn't get approval to happen. So obviously they were going to die, and ChIn was the guy that worked silently to eliminate those folks. Once John Gotti was arrested, that was really where ChIn started to get the unwanted attention. I think ChIn hated John Gotti, but I think ChIn also felt that John Gotti was a little bit of a buffer because the FBI was so obsessed with getting John Gotti off the street that for a lot of years they kind of avoided ChIn. And you know, look, any Fed will tell you they hated John Gotti. They wanted him badly, and still today. I mean, his family deals with persecution. They hated the name Gotti, and they still do. But once that happened, it was big time for Vincent Gigante. He becomes the boss of all bosses, the padrino, the capo di tutti capi. He became the big time. And it's interesting because during all this, I mean, ChIn just continues to rake in money. I mean, there was actually one racket that he had where he was given a contract, and bid rigging was huge. ChIn actually had a contract for windows. He actually replaced all the windows in every housing project in the city, which, if you know anything about New York, I mean, there are hundreds of housing projects. I mean, the level of money that he was making was just gigantic. I mean, it's amazing. But as I said earlier, one of ChIn's schemes was to avoid prosecution. He knew that if he would fake this crazy act, he could basically get off things. He could get through things. How could anyone ever think I'm a deranged invalid lunatic? Because I walk around with a bathrobe and I talk to parking meters. Now, in 1969, he had been doing this for 30 years. He had been faking and doing this insanity act forever. During all of this secret stuff, ChIn Gigante would actually walk the streets in a bathrobe. He would look like a deranged, pathetic invalid. He would walk with kind of a limp and kind of it seemed like he always had body aches. He could barely move. He barely spoke. He would urinate in public. He would talk to inanimate objects. And he basically assumed that who would ever think that I'm a mob guy? I have no way to be a mob guy. I'm a nut. I enlist my family to tell people that I'm mentally ill. And he would actually, grab his mother, his brother Louis, the priest, as his kids. I mean, his son Andrew was a direct associate. He did a lot of work for Vincent Gigante. He was a big timer in the Genovese crime family. And he had a ploy because he could always go back to, well, look, I mean, in 1969, many doctors said I was nuts. They said I had schizophrenia. But Vincent Gigante knew that this was a way to get out of things. The problem was, inevitably, charges would come from the mob. And it's interesting because even during, these times, I mean, it's interesting. ChIn would leave his mother's home. And that's one thing he would do. He didn't much come to his home in New Jersey anymore. He had kind of developed another family. And it's actually said that after he tried to bribe law enforcement in the late 60s, his wife became kind of sick of him, frankly, and he actually, in essence, divorced her. And they never officially divorced, but he became separated from her. He basically started living with his mother on Sullivan Street, and he actually found another wife. And he set her up on the Upper West Side. They had kids, and he actually had another family. So, throughout all this, he was still maintaining this shabby, nutty act. Yet at night, he would go see his gumata, basically. And he would, hold court, and that's kind of what his life was. In 1990, though, this is where it all started to go downhill for ChIn Gigante. He was arrested on racketeering and murder charges, and as usual, Gigante's lawyers produced witness by witness and evidence that ChIn was not a mobster. He was a mentally ill, deranged invalid that There's no way he could be, you know, a mobster. I mean, the problem was for ChIn, the government always had an ace up their sleeve because at this point, the only way the government can make cases was rats. And again, if I've often said this, if and this is pretty simple, if everyone continued to live like Tony Salerno and Frank Costello and lived in silence, the mob would still be huge today. The thing that ruined the mob were rats. I mean, Sammy Gravano, John Elite, Joe Messino. I mean, all these different people, Philip Leonetti, Little Al Diarco, all these guys, they were integral in bringing the mob down because unfortunately, the FBI and federal government believe rats, and that's the thing. At the end of the day, they will turn anybody. I mean, Sammy Gravano committed 19 murders, but he was looked at as the golden child for the FBI, and that's what the FBI did. They basically took Philip Leonetti and Sammy Gravano on this press tour and basically made them testify in front of every mob guy. The problem was for Gigante, Sam Gravano had direct connections with ChIn Gigante. They did business. He was perfectly clear in thinking, according to Gravano. And when they met, he would testify that ChIn was completely normal. And there was actually wiretaps that ChIn had from even conversations with his wife where, you know, anybody that's on some kind of mental spectrum, it's hard to have relationships. And ChIn would talk perfectly normal on the phone. And that was kind of the problem that he had. Yet he would use this as kind of that ruse of, there's no way they can catch me. I'm nuts. But in 1993, largely on, you know, the basis of all these rats and different things like that, it was really going to be tough for ChIn to get past this. I mean, there was a guy, Peter Savino, who was directly involved with the Windows scheme. I mean, he becomes a rat. And all these guys, Savino, Gravano, Diarco, Leonetti, all of them testified that it was common knowledge that the insanity thing was a ruse. It was not true at all. And a judge sided with the prosecution and ruled that ChIn was competent enough to stand trial. In 1997, Gigante was convicted on 8 counts of racketeering and conspiracy. The cool thing was for Gigante was there were no murders. So ChIn wasn't going to get life. He wasn't even going to get 20 or 30 years. They ended up giving him 12 years, which at that point, not a big deal. You know, the problem was ChIn was older at that point. ChIn was, you know, 69 years old, 70 years old. So for him, 12 years was a lot. And, you know, he ends up going to jail and he ends up controlling still the family. He actually used his son Andrew to basically order things through him to the family. So he was a pro at using people to commit business for him. And up until then, into his 70s, ChIn had spent very little time in prison. And that's what I find to be fascinating about him. He did so well becoming a gangster, even developing this deranged, invalid, nutty, pathetic persona to avoid law enforcement. It's truly fascinating that he was able to do it. The thing is, though, we all know that the feds will not stop until someone gets life. In 2002, Gigante was indicted again on racketeering and obstruction of justice. And the obstruction of justice came from basically the government said that his ruse to delay trial was obstruction of justice, and it was. And ChIn ends up pleading guilty. Also, his son Andrew was indicted on the message delivering that he did, so he was basically involved as well. Prosecutors for the feds basically got evidence that ChIn not only involved his son, but his family, his wife, his mistress, his brother Louis, all of them basically were under evidence that they would be told to use this act as, you know, hey, Vincent's nuts. You better stay in person. Obviously, the evidence was pretty strong. There was a lot that ChIn knew that he couldn't beat. And in 2003, wildly enough, ChIn pleads guilty to obstruction of justice, which is kind of crazy. I mean, Selwyn Rabb, who's a mob historian, he would actually mention that is unprecedented for a mob boss to plead guilty to anything. And ChIn only really agreed to the deal to ease the burden on his son and his other relatives. He basically at that point knew that he was kind of sad he had money. He knew they'd be okay, and he didn't want them to go to jail and go to prison. So he basically agrees to plead guilty to avoid his family from being the burden here. And ChIn would basically be essentially given a life sentence. I mean, at that point, the um, the 12 years that he got in 1997 really were a death sentence because in 2005, December 19, 2005, Vincent Gigante died at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. They had his funeral services a few days later in Greenwich Village. His body is at Brooklyn, New York, at the Greenwood Cemetery. He actually, ChIn had 8 kids, 5 from his original wife, Olympia, and 3 from his mistress, Olympia. Which, wildly enough, that's something wild about ChIn Gigante. His life was wild enough, but his wives were both named Olympia. Weirdly enough, I could understand like if his wife was named Kelly and his other wife's named Kelly, but like both wives were named Olympia, which I don't know. That's kind of crazy in itself. I mean, Olympia is not a real common name. But it ended up coming out later that in late into the 2011, 12, Jerry Capisci, who's a mob historian as well, who's one of the foremost authorities on the mob. He actually did a piece on ChIn's family, and ChIn's family is actually doing quite well. I mean, they all have pretty high level jobs in the New Jersey waterfront. His grandson was elected mayor in a New York town. Some of his family are high level attorneys. They all kind of did some good things. Some of them own high level restaurants. But his son, Andrew, is actually still involved with the mob. He was arrested just several years ago. And yeah, and that's kind of the book on Vincent Gigante. He's, to me, a fascinating character. I thought he was one of the more interesting, cunning folks in the history of the mob. His ability to evade law enforcement for years was really wild. I mean, you look at basically his entire life. I mean, he lived pretty deep in his life. I mean, he lived to be 77 years old. He basically spent about 10 years in prison. Now, I know for the lay person, that's a lot. I mean, most people don't spend 1 hour in prison. But at the end of the day, to be the longtime boss of the Gambino crime family, or the Genovese crime family, I'm sorry, he was basically the boss from 81 to 2005. And that's over 20 years as the boss. I mean, he had been in the mob since 1947. So almost 60 years he was in the mob. He did 10 years in jail. He made millions of dollars. It's pretty unbelievable. I mean, really, outside of Carlo Gambino, maybe Russell Buffalino. I mean, outside of those guys, I mean, ChIn did an incredible job of evading law enforcement. And, his obviously luck, his cunning nature, I think ChIn will go down as a genius, really. And it's interesting because, and just to kind of end it with this, during ChIn's life, his brother was a kind of integral part of his life. He was the only kind of normal guy in the family as far as other than his mother and father. He was the only straight one. He didn't do any criminal things. He was a priest. He insisted that ChIn Gigante had an IQ under 40, which is, I mean, very low, and that's childlike. And his mother actually, on many instances, one time his mother was asked about her son being the boss of the Genovese crime family, and she responded, and I quote, "Vincent, he's the boss of the toilet." And I don't know if that was just, and it's probably said that most of that was lies. But I think at the end of the day, Vincent Gigante was a smart guy. I think if you IQ'd him truly, his IQ would be quite good. I think he's one of the smartest mob guys in the history of the life. He knew how to be quiet. He knew how to be secret. And he knew how to be cunning. And the insane invalid idea was brilliant at the end of the day. It worked. He did it for 30 years. And I guess we'll always wonder if Vincent Gigante was actually a little insane, a little mental. And I'll end it with this. The original psychiatrist who primarily treated Vincent Gigante mentioned that in 1969, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. His list of mental illness would later include dementia and Alzheimer's. So by his later years, he could have truly had these issues. And he was actually prescribed Valium and Thorazine. And Diamo also mentioned, that was a psychiatrist, Diamo also mentioned that on 20 to 30 separate occasions, he was treated for psychiatric issues. Now, again, was that legitimate or was that just a ploy and a ruse? We'll never know. But a funny story as we end this show. An FBI agent testified that one time they did a raid on ChIn Gigante's home, or his mother's home, at 225 Sullivan Street, just up the street from the Triangle Social Club. And it was said that the cops go in the house and ChIn is naked in the shower, obviously, with an umbrella on his head. And he would do things like that to throw the law enforcement off. And it worked again. So that's the story of Vincent Gigante, a fascinating guy. It's interesting to look at, 208 Sullivan Street now. I mean, 208 Sullivan Street now is Yuppie Central. If you go to that street in New York, again, between Bleecker and 3rd Street, it's interesting because that's actually a great area for pizza. If you're ever in New York, obviously, when all this coronavirus stuff ends, whether it's Joe's or John's of Bleecker, I mean, some of the great pizza in New York. It's really kind of just north of kind of like that Spring Street area. It's between Spring and Houston, basically. So yeah, you go check that out. It's really kind of the thriving area of New York now. So there you go. There you have it. Vincent Gigante on the Crime and Mafia podcast. Hope you enjoyed episode 3. It was a bit longer than normal, but it was an important topic. My favorite topic. I actually have Vincent Gigante. I have a portrait of him above my TV in my living room. So if you ever see when I do Periscopes, you might see it in the background. That is Vincent Gigante. He's one of my favorites. So there you go. There you have it. Next week, we will continue our delve into crime and the mafia. We'll probably do Nicky Scarfo. I'm not sure. Might do Nicky Scarfo. Might do John Gotti. Not really sure yet. We still have to do Kabani Savage. We still have to do Little Melvin Williams. We still have to do Richard Kuklinski. All sorts of people to do. So if you have someone you want me to check out, make sure you reach out on Twitter. You can comment below the video or whatever. All right, folks, thanks for listening. I am the big man on campus, Jeff Nadeau. We will be back next week with episode 4. Hope you enjoyed episode 3 of the Crime and Mafia podcast. Have a great night.